The rain had been falling endlessly since the afternoon. By the time the clock neared midnight, the small town in southern Indiana seemed swallowed in a murky watercolor painting. Rain lashed down like invisible whips against tin roofs, the roads slick and gleaming under the lonely yellow streetlights. At the same time, the wind howled as if trying to uproot the lone trees standing guard along the sidewalks. Every house was shut tight, curtains drawn, windows misted over, with no light behind them. No one was out, no cars moved, no sound except the fury of nature. Yet in the middle of that stormy desolation, a lone figure moved quietly across a flooded lot behind an abandoned warehouse. Limbs unsteady, shoulders caked in mud, a skeletal German shepherd staggered forward through the damp darkness. With every step, its legs sank into waterlogged ground, dragging the thick slosh of mud clinging to its belly. Its once beautiful golden-brown coat hung in soaked clumps, matted with garbage and rotting leaves. Its hips jutted out sharply, ribs visible through thin skin. Nothing left to keep warm but sheer willpower. Its name had once been Max, a simple, warm name someone used to call out on sunny days in the backyard, tossing rubber balls for it to chase. But now, that name meant nothing. No one called it anymore. No collar, no owner, no home waiting at the end of the road. Only darkness, hunger, and the relentless cold rain surrounded it. Max crept toward a toppled trash bin, overturned by the storm. Its steps were careful, avoiding shards of broken glass hidden among the mess. It lowered its head, sniffing with a wet, trembling nose, hoping for a moldy crust of bread, a dried bone, anything to get through another night. But there was nothing. Just empty plastic bags and metal cans clinking as they hit its legs. Its stomach twisted and groaned like a forgotten child. No comfort, no gentle touch, no lullaby. How long had Max been wandering? A week? A month? Had it already survived an entire winter? It didn't know. It couldn't count the days. For a stray, time had no meaning. Only the next day of survival mattered. And maybe, if it didn't find food or shelter from this merciless rain, that next day might never come. But what kept Max walking wasn't fear of death. It was something else, deeper, something that stopped it from giving up. Memory, faded and unclear but strong enough to pull it forward. A child's laughter, a soft pat on the head for doing something right. A voice full of love calling its name every morning when the sun rose. Those memories were all Max had left, and it held on to them as tightly as the last bit of warmth in its heart. The rain hadn't stopped. The wind sliced across its skin like thin blades. Max stepped out of the alley, heading toward the edge of a forest near the highway, searching for shelter under a bridge, inside a crate, anywhere to escape the downpour. Then it stopped. Its drooping ears perked slightly. Head turned, eyes widened. It had heard something else. The sound was faint, fragile, as if trying to slip through the curtain of rain to reach someone willing to listen. A cry. Not another dog, not a stray cat, but something Max hadn't heard in years. A baby's cry. Software. Lost. And just as alone as it was in that moment. Max's tired body tightened with purpose. A primal instinct surged through its chest, drowning out the storm and hunger. It didn't know why its heart was pounding, but it knew that cry needed to be found. So, despite the storm, Max raced toward the forest, the direction of that fragile sound, where destiny waited for a nameless dog to become the hero a town would never forget. Max plunged into the night as if every wound, every ache on his body had been erased by some invisible force. An instinct, ancient and pure, to protect and preserve life. That cry, though drowned by the hammering rain and shrieking wind, was like a delicate thread tied directly to his heart, He pushed through tangled bushes, his thin body slicing through muddy water. Roots tripped him. Thorns tore at his skin and fur, but he didn't stop. The closer he got to the sound, the harder his heart pounded. Fear crept in, not for himself, but for something more fragile than life. A tiny being left alone in the cold wild. Finally, Max reached a thick, shadowy patch where wild grass tangled with soggy leaves. He sniffed close to the ground, catching a strange mix of scents: sour milk, dried blood, torn plastic, and despair. Then, under a large tree, behind a mess of fallen branches, he saw it. A small white styrofoam box, nearly buried in rotting leaves and wet earth. The water-soaked foam had turned a sickly gray. The corners cracked, its sides dented, as if carelessly thrown. The box trembled, not from the wind, but from something inside, barely moving, a breath away from silence. Max approached, nose close. He heard the faintest whimper, almost gone, and tilted his head, ears alert. The scent made him freeze. Newborn skin, pure cold, milk-scented, tear-soaked, full of a fear untouched by life. Gently, Max nudged the edge of the lid open with his nose, and there, he locked eyes with a tiny pair barely able to stay open. A baby girl, no more than a few days old, wrapped in a soaked cloth, lips blue, hands clenched tight like tiny buds against the cold. Her nostrils fluttered unevenly. Her cries had nearly silenced. Max's heart broke. He didn't understand it all, but he knew something was wrong. A baby, alone here in the woods, in a storm, inside a wet foam box. No lights, no car, no mother's arms. It didn't take a human to know this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate abandonment, a cruelty so sharp it chilled the soul. Just a few feet away, deep shoe prints in the mud told a silent story. Someone had stood there, hesitated, then turned and walked away from what they should have protected most. No one knew the reason. Maybe a panicked young mother, maybe a father too afraid of responsibility, or worse, a trafficker discarding a failed deal like defective cargo. The messy footprints left behind whispered of a choice that could never be forgiven. But Max didn't care who it was. All he knew was this. Before him was a life flickering on the edge of darkness. And if no one acted, if no one came, she would vanish by morning. Max stood for a moment, rain running down his face, eyes locked on the trembling baby. Her tiny gaze, weak as it was, stayed open, searching for warmth, for hope. Then Max lowered his head. Gently, he took the edge of the box in his teeth. The same jaws once trained to tear through enemies in the army, now gripping just tight enough to carry, not harm. And he began to pull, inch by inch, through mud, through water, through wind. He dragged the box away from that cruel place, toward anyone who might still hear a cry this world had tried to ignore. And so, in the sorrowful rain, a nameless stray dog found his purpose: to protect a small life someone else had cast aside. He began a journey without knowing where it would lead, only that he could not and would not leave this child behind, not even if the sky fell. No command had been given, no gaze to follow, no hand to point the way. But something inside Max, a voiceless call, primal and unshakable, like the blood flowing in his veins, drove him to act. On that night, when the world turned its back on the fragile life curled up in a torn foam box, Max was the only one who didn't walk away, didn't look away, didn't abandon. He lowered his head, gently clamped his teeth around the edge of the box, careful not to harm the life inside, and began to drag it out of the soaked, rotting leaves, away from the thorny branches clawing like cruel fingers, trying to keep the baby swallowed in darkness. Each inch of muddy ground was a struggle. The foam box tilted and bumped with every pull, slamming into roots, making dull thuds between the raindrops hammering from above. Max, though starved and weak, never stopped. Sometimes the box stuck under a slick moss-covered stone. Sometimes the rain blinded him so completely he could barely see. But he never lost direction. He turned back, pressed his bony shoulder against the box to push it loose, then bit onto another edge to drag it forward again, step by step, as if exhaustion and pain no longer existed in his world. There was only one mission left inside him: keep the baby alive long enough for someone to hear. On the cold earth, faint smears of blood had started to appear beneath Max's paws. His blood, seeping from scratches and reopened wounds, torn by thorns, scraped by stones. But Max didn't care. His ears stayed perked, not flattened by the howling wind, listening only for the baby's cry. And when he heard a faint whimper, a soft plea for help in the forest night, his eyes lit up again, as if her tiny voice gave him new strength to carry on. At last, after what felt like an eternity, Max reached the roadside, an old highway cutting through the edge of the forest. The road was slick, the dim lights reflecting on puddles. Not a single car in sight. The rare cars that did pass sped by too fast, spraying water in great arcs, never slowing for the raspy barking of a filthy dog standing by the shoulder next to a dented, sagging box. Max began to bark, not a bark of threat, but a desperate cry for help. Every time a car approached, he sprang up, howling with all he had left, placing his front paws on the box as if to point, as if to scream at the world, "Stop! She needs help!" But no one understood. People glanced out through rain-soaked windows and saw only a soaking wet dog, possibly dangerous, likely diseased. The rain continued its relentless assault, each drop a needle against Max's battered body, as he lay curled around the foam box, his ribs pressing sharply against his damp fur. The world had reduced itself to this single point: the fragile warmth of the tiny life inside the box, and the fading heat of his own exhausted form. His breaths came in shallow pants, each one a battle against the cold that sought to seep into his bones. But still he pressed closer, his body forming a living barrier against the storm's cruelty. The passing cars had all blurred together in his weary mind, red taillights dissolving into the downpour, engines fading like ghosts into the night. He had given everything, his voice now reduced to silent, open-mouthed pants, his legs trembling with the effort of simply staying upright. Yet when another set of headlights appeared in the distance, some primal instinct forced his head up, his ears twitching forward despite their exhaustion. This time, the lights slowed. A battered pickup truck, its windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the rain, pulled onto the shoulder with a spray of muddy water. The door creaked open, and boots splashed into the growing puddles. Max's vision swam with exhaustion, but he managed a weak thump of his tail against the wet pavement as the figure approached, not in fear, but in desperate hope. "Jesus Christ," a rough voice muttered, as the beam of a flashlight illuminated the scene. The light shook slightly as it revealed the truth. The skeletal dog curled protectively around a battered styrofoam container, his nose still pressed against its edge even as his body failed him. The man dropped to his knees, heedless of the water soaking through his jeans. His hands, calloused from years of work, trembled as they reached for the box. Max didn't growl, didn't snap, just watched with dark, liquid eyes as the lid was carefully lifted. Inside, wrapped in a soaking blanket, a newborn's face screwed up in protest at the sudden light. A weak cry, barely louder than a kitten's mewl, cut through the drumming rain. The man's breath caught. "Oh God! Oh sweet Jesus!" He fumbled for the radio on his belt, his voice breaking as he called for help, for an ambulance, for anyone. His free hand hovered over the dog, unsure whether to touch this ragged guardian angel. Max's tail thumped once more as the wail of distant sirens began to pierce the storm. His chin sank to the pavement, his job done, his watch ended. The last thing he felt as consciousness slipped away was a warm hand finally, gently, resting on his head. And in that moment, soaked to the bone and trembling with exhaustion, Max knew he had not failed. The world might have abandoned them both, but in the end, they had been found. Together. His eyes remained open, not because sleep eluded him, but because he refused to surrender to it. Not yet. Not while the fragile life inside that battered box still clung to existence. The wind roared around them, its furious gusts threatening to flip the flimsy container, but Max, his body racked with violent tremors, only curled tighter, his muscles locking like a living barricade. Each breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. His fur, soaked through, no longer held any warmth. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, sharp as knives, carving away at his strength. But he didn't whimper, didn't yield. Instead, he pressed closer still, letting the last embers of his own fading heat bleed into the box, shielding her from the void that threatened to swallow them both. Every sound sent his instincts flaring. The snap of a branch in the forest made his ears twitch. The howl of the wind sent his gaze darting into the darkness. He was a lone sentry now, a soldier without reinforcements, holding the line against an enemy far crueler than teeth or claws. Behind him, the deep footprints in the mud told their ugly truth. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had chosen this place, isolated enough to hide their crime, just close enough to feign plausible hope. A calculated abandonment, a decision to discard life without consequence. And when they walked away, they left death waiting in their wake, cold, silent, patient. But Max, with nothing left but the stubborn fire in his chest, stood between that darkness and the life he refused to let it claim. The night stretched on, endless. Rain fell in sheets. Wind screamed through the trees. The road ahead remained a black abyss, as if dawn had been erased from the world. Yet Max didn't move. Not when his body finally stopped trembling from exhaustion. Not when his eyelids crusted with mud. Not even when the sour tang of decay seemed to rise from his own battered frame. He stayed. Not because he'd been trained to. Not because anyone had asked it of him, but because some souls are born to protect, to love, to stand between the world's cruelty and the fragile things worth saving. And so, in the hour before morning's first light, before the sun dared to touch the frozen earth, a nameless stray, a creature the world had deemed worthless, taught it the true meaning of something priceless. Inside that ruined box, life still flickered, not by chance, not by luck, but because one trembling skeletal body had refused to let the last spark go out. And when the night finally loosened its grip, when the storm relented and left behind only mist and rain-speckled silence, the dawn broke gray and quiet over the small town. There, on the roadside, two heartbeats remained, one fading, one still fighting, both alive. For now, the world lay heavy and still in the storm's aftermath, bathed in the pale, watery light of dawn. Everything shimmered with a damp silver glow, the puddles reflecting the bruised sky, the drooping tree branches swaying wearily like exhausted sentinels, the road itself seeming to exhale mist as it emerged from its long, terrible night. The air smelled of wet earth and something sharper, something like hope struggling to be born. At the edge of that lonely road, where darkness had ruled unchallenged for endless hours, where only the merciless rain and howling wind had stood witness, lay a motionless figure curled protectively around a battered foam box. The dog's body formed a perfect crescent around its charge, his matted fur still dripping, his ribs visible even beneath the soaked coat. He looked like a statue of devotion carved by the storm itself. Margaret Lewis, 52 years old, stout of frame and solitary by nature, stepped out onto her porch that morning as she had every morning for 20 years. The umbrella in her hand caught the last few stubborn raindrops as she began her familiar trudge to the diner where she worked the breakfast shift. But this morning, something made her pause at the corner. Some primal instinct raised the hairs on her thick arms before her conscious mind understood why. There, just beyond the ditch, where rainwater still gurgled angrily, lay a dark shape that didn't belong. A large, sodden mass curled around something white and dented. Margaret's pace quickened without her realizing it, her sensible shoes splashing through puddles as her grip tightened on both umbrella and handbag. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made her breath catch. A German shepherd, so emaciated his hip bones jutted sharply, even through his soaked fur, curled in a perfect protective circle around a foam box that looked like it had been through a war. The dog lay so still Margaret's heart clenched with sudden grief, certain she was looking at death itself. But when she knelt in the wet grass, her knees immediately soaking through her polyester slacks, and reached out a trembling hand to brush away the twigs and leaves stuck to the dog's back, she felt the faintest tremor of life. Warmth. A heartbeat. The dog's eyes were closed but fluttered weakly at her touch, hovering in that fragile space between consciousness and oblivion. Then, the sound. From inside the box Margaret had assumed contained nothing more than rainwater and garbage came a noise so soft it might have been the wind. A mewling, fragile cry that stopped Margaret's own breath in her throat. With hands that shook violently, she peeled back the soaked cloth covering the box's contents. The world tilted. A baby. A newborn. Its umbilical cord still attached, its skin tinged an awful bluish gray. Tiny cracked lips parted around weak, gasping breaths. Miniature fists clenched and unclenched in distress. The child's chest rose and fell in terrifyingly shallow movements, each breath looking like it might be the last. Margaret reeled back instinctively, nearly losing her balance in the mud. A strangled sound escaped her throat, part gasp, part sob. For one terrible second, her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Then training, she didn't know she had took over. She lunged forward, gathering the box carefully into her arms, cradling it against her chest to share what little warmth her body could offer. Her eyes, wide with shock and brimming with tears, snapped to the dog. "Oh, my sweet Jesus," she whispered, her voice breaking like the storm clouds above them. Have you been here all night? Like this? Keeping her warm?" The baby whimpered again, the sound barely louder than a mouse's sigh. And Max, because of course it was Max, though Margaret didn't know that yet, managed to crack open one eye. Just a sliver, just enough to meet Margaret's gaze with his own clouded one. What came from his throat wasn't a growl or a whine, but something deeper. A sound that bypassed language entirely and went straight to the primal core of understanding, a plea that needed no translation. Margaret understood. Her tears fell freely now as she fumbled for her phone with numb fingers. The world narrowed to three things: the dying dog, the fragile child, and the phone. Hat refused to cooperate with her shaking hands. "Hold on," she begged them both, her voice thick. "Just hold on, you beautiful, brave things." And as the first sirens wailed in the distance, the sun, the real sun, not just the pale imitation that had been teasing them all morning, finally broke through the clouds. Its golden light spilled across the scene, gilding the dog's matted fur, warming the baby's blue-tinged skin, catching the tears on Margaret's weathered cheeks. It was the light, more than anything else, that made Margaret believe they might all survive this. That made her believe in miracles. That made her understand in her bones that she was witnessing something sacred, the moment when the world could have ended but didn't. The world seemed to hold its breath as Margaret knelt in the wet grass, her arms forming a protective cradle around the foam box. The dog's shallow breathing had grown even fainter, his once bright eyes now dimming like fading embers. Yet in that exhausted gaze, Margaret saw something that shattered her, a trust so complete, a love so unconditional, it had carried this creature to the very edge of death without hesitation. Her hands shook violently as she abandoned her umbrella, the phone nearly slipping from her rain-slicked fingers. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's voice sounded impossibly distant. There's a baby, Margaret choked out, her voice raw. A newborn, and a dog. I think, I think he saved her life. The words tumbled out between shuddering breaths as her tears mixed with the morning mist still clinging to her face. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the damp air, their rhythmic pulses growing louder, stronger, a lifeline threading through the fog. Margaret clutched the box tighter, her knuckles whitening. Somewhere deep in her chest, a quiet certainty took root. This moment had already changed everything. For the child, for the dog, for her. The ambulance screeched to a halt in a spray of rainwater, its red lights painting the scene in urgent flashes. 3 EMTs exploded from the vehicle, their movements sharp with practiced urgency. Officer Neil Grant arrived moments later, his stomach tightening the instant he took in the scene. The ashen-faced woman, the skeletal dog, the battered container that held something far more precious than anyone could have imagined. Paramedic Clarissa Morales dropped to her knees beside Margaret, her experienced hands moving with deliberate care as she peeled back the soaked cloth. Her breath caught. A baby girl, so small, so fragile, her skin tinged blue, her lips nearly black with cold. The tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular hitches. "She's breathing," Clarissa whispered, more to herself than anyone else, as she cocooned the infant in a thermal blanket. Still breathing. Each word felt like a fragile prayer against the morning air. Nearby, the dog lay motionless, his ribs barely rising now. But as the medical team worked, his clouded eyes tracked their movements, watching, always watching, until the last of his strength ebbed away with the retreating storm. The second EMT knelt beside the dog, his practiced fingers moving swiftly over the animal's battered body. The injuries told a brutal story. Dried blood matting the fur in stiff clumps, old wounds reopened from the night's ordeal, a dislocated left paw hanging at an unnatural angle. When they lifted him onto the stretcher, his body was frighteningly light, like a bundle of sticks wrapped in damp fur. As they secured him, the dog's eyes fluttered open one last time, clouded with exhaustion but still desperately scanning for the box, for the tiny life he'd shielded through the storm's fury. He couldn't lift his head, couldn't whimper, but the message in that fading gaze was unmistakable. "I gave everything. Keep her safe." Margaret stood rooted to the spot, her arms still cradling empty air where the box had been. The female officer's questions barely registered. "Any identification? A note?" The words sounded hollow against the roaring in Margaret's ears. She could only shake her head, her throat too tight for speech. There was nothing. Just a child left like refuse in the night. Officer Grant moved methodically around the scene, his flashlight beam tracing the deep footprints leading from the woods. Too large to be Margaret's, too fresh to be anything but damning evidence. His jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident. Someone had stood right here, made a conscious choice, then walked away. The thought settled like ice in his gut. Inside the ambulance, the world narrowed to the rhythmic beep of monitors and Clarissa's steady hands. When she asked about a name, Margaret didn't hesitate. "Mira," she whispered, her calloused finger brushing the baby's impossibly small hand. "Her name is Mira." The word meant miracle in some languages, and nothing had ever been more true. At the veterinary clinic, the young doctor's face paled as he assessed the dog's condition, not just the physical trauma, the torn pads, the cracked ribs, the hypothermia, but what the wounds represented. This animal had pushed far beyond any reasonable limit of endurance. When the intake nurse asked for a name, Margaret leaned close to the stretcher. "Guardian," she said softly. "His name is Guardian now." Outside, the morning mist curled around Margaret as she watched both ambulances disappear, one toward the city's gleaming hospital towers, the other to the modest vet clinic on Elm Street. Her shoes were ruined, her slacks soaked through, but she couldn't bring herself to move just yet. The ground beneath her feet felt sacred now, hallowed by the night's impossible acts of courage. Somewhere ahead lay paperwork, questions, the cold machinery of official procedures. But in this suspended moment, there was only the quiet certainty that two souls, one just beginning her journey, one who'd nearly ended his, had rewritten the story the world tried to give them. And Margaret, who'd spent 20 years walking the same lonely route to the same lonely diner, found herself standing at the start of a path she never saw coming. The first real sunlight broke through then, painting the wet road in gold. Margaret took a deep breath, turned toward town, and began to walk, not to the diner this time, but to the hospital. Someone needed to be there when Mira woke up, and someone needed to bring Guardian news of the life he'd saved. At Indiana State Children's Hospital, the neonatal intensive care unit hummed with quiet urgency. Soft golden light bathed the rows of incubators, their rhythmic beeps creating an odd sort of lullaby. Mira lay swaddled in warming blankets, her tiny body dwarfed by the web of tubes and monitors keeping her alive. The senior pediatrician, Dr. Eleanor Cho, moved with practiced precision as she examined the newborn, until her hands stilled abruptly. The room's atmosphere shifted instantly. Faint bruises mottled Mira's lower abdomen in sickly yellow-green patches. Shallow scratches circled her wrists like grotesque bracelets. And across her back, barely visible against her fragile skin, ran a series of thin, parallel marks that made Dr. Cho's stomach turn, the kind left by desperate fingernails or deliberate claws. No one spoke. The nurses exchanged glances heavy with unspoken horror. This wasn't just abandonment. Someone had hurt this child before discarding her like trash. 2 miles away, the fluorescent lights of Elm Street Veterinary Clinic buzzed softly as Dr. Raymond Harris examined his unusual patient. Under the clinical brightness, every injury told its grim story. The swollen front leg from dragging that box through the storm, the raw abrasions across his chest from forcing his way through brambles. But it was the old wounds that made Raymond's hands still. The jagged scar across Guardian's shoulder, clearly stitched by unskilled hands, the patch of bare skin around his neck where a too-tight collar had worn away fur permanently. When Raymond gently probed the bruised neck, expecting flinching or growls, Guardian simply looked up with eyes that held lifetimes of pain and asked, silently but unmistakably, "Will you hurt me too?" Raymond's breath caught. In 30 years of practice, he'd never seen such quiet dignity in the face of so much betrayal. His fingers, which had mended thousands of animals, trembled slightly as they stroked Guardian's head in wordless promise. Back at the hospital, Margaret sat vigil beside Mira's incubator, her work-worn hands pressed against the glass. She didn't see the bruises or the monitors. She saw only the tiny fingers that had somehow, impossibly, curled around hers when she'd carried the box to the ambulance. The faintest grip, but enough to bind their fates together. And in that moment, as two broken souls fought for survival in separate buildings, something remarkable began to take shape. Not just a story of rescue, but of reckoning. Because the wounds on Mira's body and the scars on Guardian's told matching stories. And Margaret, with her diner waitress hands and lioness heart, would soon realize the abandoned child and the broken dog weren't just connected by chance. They were connected by cruelty, and by the person who had hurt them both. Raymond stared at the whiteboard, the marker still poised in his hand. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting sterile brightness over Guardian's battered form. The nurse's question hung in the air. Where did this dog come from? But the answer was written in every scar, every wound, every labored breath. He came from hell, Raymond finally said, his voice rough, and brought back an angel. With deliberate strokes, he crossed out unnamed stray and wrote, Guardian, the protector. The name settled over the room like a benediction. That night, in two different buildings separated by 2 miles of rain-slicked roads, two fragile lives hung in the balance. In the NICU, Mira lay cocooned in the glow of warming lights, her tiny chest rising and falling to the mechanical rhythm of ventilators. The bruises on her wrists stood out in lurid contrast against the sterile white sheets, fingerprints of cruelty that made even the most seasoned nurses avert their eyes. At the clinic, Guardian drifted in a medicated haze, his body swaddled in heated blankets, IV fluid slowly replenishing what the storm had stolen. The jagged scar across his shoulder twitched, occasionally, as if, even in sleep, he was still dragging that box to safety. Down the hospital corridor, Officer Grant stood rigid as Special Agent Vasquez from the State Crimes Unit flipped through the preliminary report. The folder in Vasquez's hands wasn't just paperwork, it was a roadmap to horror. These marks on the infant's wrists? Vasquez's finger tapped a crime scene photo. That's restraint trauma. And these parallel lacerations on the back, his jaw tightened. Someone tried to claw their way out of that box before abandoning it. The implications hung heavy between them. This wasn't just a desperate mother's act. The precision of the location, the timing, the deliberate lack of identifiers, it all pointed to something far more calculated. Meanwhile, at Child Protective Services, Linda Carter sat motionless at her desk, the case file open before her. The clinical photos of Mira's injuries blurred slightly as she read the accompanying medical report. Her pen hovered over the standard placement forms, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was the notation about the dog, the way the animal had apparently shielded the child through the storm. With sudden decision, Linda reached for her phone. There was one name in her contacts she hadn't dialed in years, one person who might understand the extraordinary nature of this case. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Margaret Lewis, currently sitting vigil in a NICU waiting room, her hands still smelling of antiseptic and earth. Ms. Lewis? Linda's professional tone barely concealed the urgency beneath. We need to talk about Guardian, and about who might have hurt them both. But life had other plans, and sometimes the heart recognizes its calling before the mind can rationalize it away. Linda listened, her pen hovering over her notepad as Margaret spoke, not with the rehearsed fervor of someone trying to convince, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made up her mind. I know what you're thinking, Margaret said, her voice steady, that I'm too old, that it's too much, that I don't know what I'm signing up for. And you're right, I don't, not fully. But I do know this. When I knelt in that mud and saw them, Mira fighting for breath, Guardian barely holding on, something in me just clicked, like a lock turning open. I can't explain it better than that. Linda studied her. The file in front of her listed facts: Margaret's age, her income, her small one-bedroom apartment. But the woman sitting across from her defied those facts. There was a steeliness in her gaze, a resolve that didn't waver under scrutiny. "And the dog?" Linda asked, testing. "You realize Guardian may never fully recover. He could have lasting health issues, trauma, behavioral problems. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "He dragged himself through a storm to keep a baby alive. If he can do that, I can figure out the rest." A long silence stretched between them. Then Linda closed the folder with a soft snap. "Most people," she said carefully, "would have called 911 and walked away. Some might have visited once or twice, maybe left a stuffed animal by the incubator. Very few would sit in a hospital for days, then follow a broken dog to a vet clinic, then ask to take both home." Margaret shrugged. "Most people haven't met Mira and Guardian." Linda exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible release of tension. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, just a little, that this might be different. That this woman, with her calloused hands and unshakable quiet, might actually be the real thing. "All right," Linda said, sliding a form across the table. "Let's talk about what happens next." And just like that, in a sterile conference room under flickering fluorescent lights, a family began to take shape, not out of blood or obligation, but because three souls, against all odds, had refused to let each other go. Though the case file was still filled with pending conditions and Linda's official recommendation remained cautious, something unexpected began to happen. The story of the abandoned baby and the stray dog who protected her started spreading through the hospital corridors, the vet clinic, the police station, whispered in break rooms, shared over coffee, posted quietly on community boards. And then the letters started coming. Envelopes addressed simply to "the baby and the dog" arrived at the hospital, filled with checks, cash, and notes scrawled in shaky handwriting, for formula, for vet bills, for whatever they need. A local diaper company donated a year's supply. A retired pediatric nurse showed up at Margaret's apartment unannounced, offering free checkups. The diner where Margaret worked surprised her with a fundraiser, regulars slipping 20s into a jar labeled "For Mira and Guardian." Linda watched it all unfold with guarded amazement. She had spent decades building systems to protect the vulnerable, yet here was something her paperwork couldn't account for: the quiet, stubborn way ordinary people had decided, without being asked, that these two broken lives mattered. Meanwhile, Guardian's recovery was slow but steady. His wounds healed, his ribs filled out under regular meals, and though he would always walk with a slight limp from his dislocated paw, his eyes, once clouded with pain, began to clear. The first time Margaret brought Mira home from the hospital, Guardian stood at the door of his crate, ears pricked, tail giving a single cautious wag. When Margaret settled the baby on the couch, Guardian didn't jump up or crowd her. He simply lay down at Margaret's feet, his chin resting on his paws, watching over them both. Linda came by for the final home inspection, clipboard in hand, checking off safety latches, stocked formula, a crib up to code. She paused when she saw Guardian's bed placed deliberately beside Mira's bassinet. "You know the rules," Linda said, her tone neutral. "Animals can't be left unsupervised with infants." Margaret nodded. "He doesn't need to be told." As if on cue, Guardian lifted his head, his gaze shifting from Mira to Linda, steady, patient, as if to say, "I've got this." Linda exhaled. For the first time since they'd met, the corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. The paperwork was finalized the next day. Temporary foster placement approved. Guardianship of the dog acknowledged. A footnote in the file, written in Linda's precise handwriting. Case exhibits extraordinary circumstances. Subject, child, shows marked improvement in presence of caregiver and animal. Recommend continued observation, but initial concerns mitigated by community support and caregivers' demonstrated commitment. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a happy ending. Not yet. But it was a start. And so, in a small apartment on the edge of town, a family took shape, one built not by blood, but by a storm, a box, and the unshakable belief that no one, whether child or creature, should ever have to face the dark alone. Guardian slept soundly that night, his body curled protectively around the bassinet, and for the first time in his life, he dreamed without flinching. To understand the magic of a baby's first laugh, yet there he was, his tail giving a slow, deliberate wag as he pushed the ball again, watching with quiet pride as Mira's tiny hands flailed in delight. Margaret stood frozen, a towel still clutched in her hands, tears blurring her vision. It wasn't just the sound of laughter, it was the certainty of it. The unshakable proof that joy could take root even in the most broken of places. Guardian turned his head toward her then, his ears lifting slightly, as if to say, "Do you see it too?" And Margaret did. She saw it all. The way Mira's fingers curled around the edge of the crib when Guardian leaned closer, the way his breathing seemed to sync with hers, the way the afternoon light pooled around them like something holy. Later that evening, when Linda Carter arrived unannounced for her final assessment, she found them like that, Mira dozing in her crib, one tiny fist clutching the frayed edge of Guardian's blanket, while the dog lay beside her, his chin resting on the mattress, eyes half-lidded but alert. Margaret, stirring a pot of soup in the kitchen, didn't hear Linda enter. It wasn't until she turned and saw the social worker standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, that Margaret's breath caught. Linda said nothing at first, just stepped forward, her polished shoes silent on the worn linoleum, and paused beside the crib. For a long moment she watched, the rise and fall of Mira's chest, the way Guardian's ears twitched at the sound of her approach, but he didn't move, his body still shielding the baby even in sleep. Then, without a word, Linda reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the adoption approval form, already signed. Margaret's hands trembled as she took it, the ink still fresh, the stamp official and final. "I don't usually do this," Linda said quietly, her voice softer than Margaret had ever heard it. "But some things even the rules can't measure." And with that, she turned and walked out, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume, something floral, unexpectedly tender, and the weight of a silence that wasn't empty anymore, but full. That night, as Margaret settled into bed, she left the bedroom door open, just a crack, so she could hear the quiet sounds of the house, the creak of Guardian shifting on his bed, the soft sigh of Mira's breath, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Outside, the rain began again, gentle this time, not a storm, just water washing the world clean. And in the dark, two heartbeats, one steady, one still learning, sang back to the thunder, no longer afraid. Raymond's fingers stilled over the tattoo, the numbers stark against Guardian's weathered skin. The truth settled over him like a weight. This wasn't just a stray. This was a soldier, a dog trained to serve, to protect, only to be discarded when he was no longer useful. He exhaled sharply, his breath fogging the clinic window as he looked out at Guardian lying in the evening light. The way the dog carried himself, The alert tilt of his ears at certain sounds, the strategic positioning of his body. It all made sense now. That night, Raymond stayed late, digging through military databases, cross-referencing the tattoo with decommission records. The screen's blue glow etched shadows under his eyes as the story unfolded. K9, Unit 7. Designation: Ajax. Specialization: Search and Rescue. Explosive Detection. Service: 4 years, 2 deployments. Discharge status: Medical, shoulder injury, sustained in active duty. There was no record of what happened after, no adoption papers, no retirement home for working dogs, just a blank space where a loyal life had fallen through the cracks. Raymond's hands clenched. He thought of Guardian dragging that box through the storm, of the way he'd positioned himself between Mira and every door, every stranger, of the scars that spoke not of accidents, but of neglect. This dog hadn't just found a purpose that night in the woods, he'd returned to it. The next morning, Raymond arrived at Margaret's doorstep, a file tucked under his arm. Margaret took one look at his face and wordlessly stepped aside. They sat at her kitchen table, Guardian lying at their feet, his chin resting on Mira's blanket as she babbled in her playpen. Raymond slid the folder across the table. "His name was Ajax," he said quietly. Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. Service records, injury reports, a grainy photo of a younger, prouder dog wearing a tactical vest. "He was a hero long before he met you," Raymond continued. "But someone forgot that when he got hurt." Margaret's tears fell onto the photo. Guardian, Ajax, lifted his head at the sound, his dark eyes meeting hers. In them, she saw no bitterness, no regret, just the same quiet devotion that had carried a baby through the storm. She reached down, running her fingers over the tattoo behind his ear. "You've been protecting people your whole life, haven't you?" Guardian exhaled through his nose, a soft whoosh of air that stirred Mira's curls as she reached for him. His tail thumped once on the floor, not in excitement, but in quiet affirmation. Raymond cleared his throat. "There's more. The military might owe him, and you, compensation. Medical care, at least." Margaret shook her head, smiling through her tears. "What we have can't be bought." She touched the file gently. "But thank you for giving him back his name." That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Margaret sat on the porch with Guardian's head in her lap, tracing the numbers behind his ear while Mira slept inside. "Ajax," she whispered experimentally. The dog didn't react to the name, just nuzzled her hand, his breath warm against her skin. Margaret smiled. Some names belonged to the past. The one that mattered now was the one he'd earned in the dark, keeping watch over a life the world had tried to throw away. Guardian. And as the fireflies blinked to life in the gathering dusk, she knew, no matter what the record said, no matter where he'd been, this was where his story had always been leading. Home. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. Raymond's report landed in Chief Grant's inbox at 3:17 a.m., but it wasn't until dawn that the real storm began. At the precinct, Grant spread the documents across his desk: Guardian's military records, Ethan Brower's criminal file, the forensic report from Mira's abandoned box. The burn marks on her back weren't from claws. They matched the distinctive scarring patterns of military-grade detonation cord, the kind used in the same operation where Maverick had supposedly died. Linda Carter arrived just as Grant was barking orders to his team. She took one look at the evidence and went pale. "That dog didn't just find Mira," she said quietly. He recognized something in her. Ethan Brower's apartment stank of stale coffee and gun oil when SWAT breached the door at 6:02 a.m. The laptop still played the grainy footage: a desert night, a dog straining at its leash, a child's whimper off camera before the screen cut to static. But Brower was gone, leaving behind only a map circled in red, Margaret's neighborhood. Margaret didn't understand the police car surrounding her house until Grant showed her the photo. A younger, sharper-faced guardian, Maverick, sitting at attention beside a soldier with cold eyes. "That's Brower," Grant said. "We think he faked Maverick's death to sell him on the black market. When the dog escaped, Brower shifted to trafficking something even more valuable." His jaw tightened. Mira wasn't just abandoned. She was stolen. And Guardian's been protecting her this whole time because he knew. Guardian knew the scent before the doorbell rang. His entire body went rigid, a low growl building in his chest as Margaret answered the door to Linda and two officers. But it wasn't them he was watching. It was the shadow moving near the tree line. A figure in black, face obscured by a hood. The gunshot cracked through the morning like thunder. Margaret screamed as the window shattered, but Guardian was already moving, not away from the danger but toward Mira's crib, his body slamming into it with enough force to send it skidding across the floor as a second bullet punched through the wall where she'd been seconds before. Then chaos. SWAT pouring from unmarked vans, Linda dragging Margaret to cover, Guardian standing over the overturned crib like a sentinel, his lips peeled back in a snarl no civilian dog could muster. Somewhere in the fray, a shout, "Sniper, in the trees!" And then, a sound Guardian hadn't heard in years. A whistle. Two sharp notes, rising. His recall command. Guardian's ears flicked. For one terrible second, his training warred with his loyalty. Then Mira whimpered beneath him, and the choice was made. They found Ethan Brower half a mile away, his leg torn open by canine teeth, his pistol still smoking. "That's my dog," he spat as they cuffed him. "That's my property." Chief Grant leaned down, his voice icy. "Funny, military database says he died a hero." He held up the photo of Brower kneeling beside Maverick's empty vest, the same vest now being analyzed for DNA. "Guess which one of you that still applies to?" The news vans came next, of course. The headlines wrote themselves. "War hero dog saves abducted infant." But in Margaret's quiet living room, with Guardian's head heavy in her lap and Mira sleeping safely upstairs, the only story that mattered was the lick on her fingers, rough, warm, and unmistakably his. Not a weapon, not a soldier, just a good dog. And as the last of the police cars pulled away, Margaret whispered the only words that still needed saying, "Welcome home, Guardian." The collar they gave him that afternoon bore no number. Just a single word etched in steel, family. Margaret rode in the ambulance, her hands clutching Mira's tiny fingers as the medical team worked frantically. The world outside the speeding vehicle blurred into streaks of light and shadow, but all she could see was the rise and fall of Mira's chest. Too shallow, too slow. Guardian, left behind at the house, paced the length of the living room, his claws clicking against the hardwood. He didn't whine, didn't lie down, just walked, back and forth, as if his body couldn't bear stillness when his heart was elsewhere. At the hospital, doctors stabilized Mira, confirming the reaction had been triggered by a rare protein in the new formula. "Another 30 minutes without oxygen," one nurse murmured, "and she might not have made it." Margaret didn't speak, just pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the NICU window, watching the machines breathe for her child. Back home, Guardian finally collapsed onto Mira's blanket, his nose buried in the fabric, inhaling the fading scent of her. His body ached, old wounds flaring, muscles stiff from tension, but his ears stayed pricked, listening for a sound that wouldn't come. Not yet. It wasn't until the next morning, when Margaret returned, her face drawn with exhaustion but her eyes alight with relief, That guardian finally moved. He met her at the door, his entire body vibrating with unspoken questions. Margaret knelt, her knees cracking against the floor, and wrapped her arms around him. "She's okay," she whispered into his fur. "Because of you." Again. Guardian exhaled a long, shuddering breath and leaned into her. Later, when Linda Carter stopped by with paperwork for the hospital bills, already covered by an anonymous donor, she found them like that. Margaret asleep on the couch, Guardian draped across her feet, one paw stretched out as if still reaching for Mira's empty crib. Linda didn't wake them, just set the paperwork on the table and added a note of her own. Guardian's alertness saved Mira's life. Again. Recommend permanent placement be expedited. Some bonds transcend documentation. And for the first time in her career, she didn't just sign her name. She drew a small heart beside it. When Mira came home 2 days later, Guardian didn't leave her side, not to eat, not to sleep. He lay beside her crib, his nose inches from her tiny fingers, his ears twitching at every shift in her breathing. Margaret watched them from the doorway, her arms crossed against the chill. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the world in quiet. Somewhere out there, a man named Brower sat in a jail cell, his fate sealed by his own cruelty. But in this house, in this room, two souls who had been lost to the world, one small, one scarred, breathed in unison, alive, together. Home. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken understanding. Linda knelt slowly, her polished shoes sinking into the sterile hospital carpet until she was eye level with Guardian. His gaze never wavered, tired but unwavering. "You," Linda whispered, her voice breaking just once, "are not just a dog, are you?" Guardian exhaled through his nose, a quiet whoosh of air that stirred the edge of Mira's blanket. His tail gave a single exhausted thump against the floor. Linda reached out, hesitated, then let her fingers brush the top of his head. His fur was warm, softer than she expected. When she stood, her knees protested, but her hands didn't shake as she pulled the final approval form from her briefcase. The one that would make it official, Margaret as Mira's legal guardian, and Guardian as part of that family. No conditions, no more evaluations. She signed it right there, against the hospital room wall, her pen digging into the paper with a certainty she hadn't felt in years. Margaret stirred, blinking up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Linda?" Linda didn't answer, just handed her the form. Margaret's breath hitched as she read it. Then, without a word, she reached out and gripped Linda's hand so tight it hurt. Guardian watched them both, his ears twitching at the sound of Mira's steady, sleeping breaths. Somewhere beyond the hospital windows, dawn was breaking, pale gold light spilling over the rooftops, the streets, the quiet places where other stories like this one might still be waiting to unfold. But here, in this room, the ending was finally written. Linda turned to leave, pausing only once at the door. Behind her, Margaret was already dozing again, her cheek pressed against Mira's crib. Guardian's head had sunk onto his paws at last, his body curled protectively around them both. For the first time in her career, Linda Carter walked away from a case not with relief, but with something rarer: awe, and the quiet certainty that some souls, whether on 2 legs or 4, were simply born to find each other, no matter how broken the path, no matter how long the night. And if, years later, a little girl with scars on her back and a dog with a soldier's heart were seen walking together under the trees, no one questioned it, because by then, the whole town knew. Where Mira went, Guardian followed, and where Guardian led, Mira was always safe. The photo went viral overnight, not because it was perfectly framed, it wasn't. The lighting was harsh, the hospital room sterile, the edges slightly blurred from a shaky hand. But what it captured was undeniable. A scarred dog, his body curled like a living barricade around a sleeping infant, his nose just inches from her tiny fingers. His eyes weren't closed in sleep, but open, watchful, alive, with a devotion so fierce it seemed to transcend species. Guardian angels come in all forms, read the caption. By noon, the hospital switchboard was flooded. Strangers called asking about the baby and the dog. News vans parked outside Margaret's modest home. A local bakery started a fundraiser, selling Guardian's Hero cookies, dog biscuits for pets, sugar cookies for humans, with all proceeds going to Mira's medical fund. A retired seamstress knitted matching scarves for Mira and Guardian in deep blue, the color of loyalty. But the real change wasn't in the headlines or the donations. It was in the quiet moments no camera captured. The way the pediatric nurses now left an extra chair in Mira's room, not for Margaret, but for Guardian, who refused to leave even for meals. The way the mailman started carrying treats in his pocket, not just for Guardian, but for every stray he passed on his route, his eyes softer than before. The way Linda Carter, once known for her steel-trap professionalism, now kept a framed copy of that photo on her desk, its edges slightly crumpled from how often she'd taken it out to show colleagues. And then there was Margaret. She never asked for the attention, never gave interviews. But when she walked through town now, Mira in a sling against her chest, Guardian trotting at her side, people didn't just nod politely. They stopped. They smiled. Some even reached out, not to pet Guardian, but to press his paw gently between their hands, as if touching something holy. Because in a world that often felt fractured, here was proof that some bonds could not be broken, that a dog declared dead could come back to life for a child who needed him. That love, in its purest form, required no language, only presence. And on the day the official paperwork arrived, granting Margaret permanent guardianship of Mira and recognizing Guardian as her licensed protector, the town threw a party. Not in the square with speeches, but in the park with hot cocoa and a cake shaped like a bone for Guardian and a rattle for Mira. As snow began to fall, Margaret knelt beside Guardian, her fingers buried in his fur. "Look at what you did," she whispered. "You didn't just save her, you saved all of us." Guardian huffed, his breath fogging the cold air, and leaned into her touch. The spreading light of Guardian's story struck fear into those who had tried to bury it. Ethan Brower, the man who abandoned Mira in the woods after a failed deal, now saw himself exposed beneath a spotlight he could no longer control. He watched the coverage, read the articles, and every time the name Guardian was mentioned, his eyes darkened, as if haunted by a ghost he thought had disappeared. As for Guardian, the center of it all, he knew nothing of the praise, the hashtags, or the live streams calling his name. He only knew the crib he lay beside every morning, the moment Mira stirred and took her first breath of the day. He knew the meals from Margaret's hand, Mira's laughter as the most precious reward. And each night, he lay at his post on the wooden floor of their modest home, front legs crossed, eyes half open, always ready to protect again if needed. To Guardian, being a hero was never a title. It was the choice to stay, even when the world once turned its back. Somewhere beyond the glow of phone screens, thank you cards, and children's rainbow-colored drawings, the heart of a small town, and maybe even a whole nation, began to beat again, more gently, more humanely, because of a dog who once had no name, no home, no chance. A dog who chose to love, to stay, and to survive, not just for himself, but for a miracle named Mira. When the name Guardian was no longer just a quiet symbol on social media, but had become a living legend in Evansdale, it was the people themselves, those who once passed each other like strangers, who came together to write a new chapter in a story already full of magic. They didn't just want to thank the dog. They wanted to become part of something bigger, something lasting, something that would keep spreading even when the news cycle moved on. And so, the Hearts for Hope Charity Festival was born, not from a committee, but from a heartbeat shared by hundreds, newly reminded of what it meant to care. The Central Park lawn, once used for summer fairs and outdoor movies, was transformed into a sea of red, the color of love and hope. Tables draped in floral cloth lined the pathways. Local vendors sold homemade cookies. High schoolers ran craft booths with wooden signs reading, "Art for Shelter, help build a home for kids like Mira." Streamers fluttered from tree to tree, balloons floated in the sun, and the town glowed with a purity it hadn't felt in years. But the moment that brought the crowd to silence wasn't the music nor the speeches. It was when Guardian appeared from behind the stage, walking slowly beside Dr. Raymond Harris, wearing a red vest with white embroidered words, "Miracle Dog." The vest fit snugly over his strong graying frame. The old scars beneath his coat shimmered faintly in the sunlight, not hidden, but worn like medals. As Guardian climbed the wooden steps of the stage, he didn't look to the applauding crowd. His eyes went straight to a stroller near the front, where Mira sat in a white dress with floral embroidery, a red bow in her hair, sucking her fingers, smiling at her protector. She reached toward him, and Guardian, without cue or command, stepped down from the stage, walked straight to her, and rested his nose gently on the edge of her stroller. The moment was captured in a single photo, later used as the festival symbol, printed across the banner hanging over the new headquarters of the Hearts for Hope Foundation. Not the same species, just the same heartbeat. Children gathered around him, not with chaos but quiet awe. Some brought cookies. Some sat on the grass to sketch him in crayon. Others just stroked his back gently and whispered to their mothers, "I want a dog like him to protect my baby sister." Guardian didn't bark. He didn't perform, but every tilt of his head, every slow wag of his tail was a thank you. And more than that, a reminder. Kindness doesn't need to shout to be extraordinary. On stage, after the mayor's emotional speech, his voice thick as he said, "We honor a nameless dog with no family, once discarded, who picked up a piece of humanity we had forgotten." Came the big announcement. All proceeds from the festival would fund two parallel charities, one for emergency support for abandoned children, Mira's Light, the other for abused animals, Guardian's Way. Applause erupted. Margaret stood beside Mira's stroller, smiling quietly, one hand resting on Guardian's back like she was whispering through her touch. "We did it, didn't we, boy?" But on the quiet edge of the park, another pair of eyes watched. Hidden under a low baseball cap, cloaked in a dark jacket, stood a man separated from the crowd, yet hearing every word, every cheer. Ethan Brower, the man who had once left Mira to die in the woods, the man who thought Guardian was long gone. And when he saw the dog he'd written off as lost, now standing on a sunlit stage, hailed as a living legend, his mouth curled into a slow, cold smile. He stepped back into the shadows. The applause faded from his ears. "So you're still alive, Maverick." As the last round of applause echoed through Evansdale Park, mingling with the gentle music and the carefree laughter of children, it seemed that the Hearts for Hope Festival had truly become a symbol of rebirth, a place where kindness triumphed and the past was forgiven. But beneath the colorful stalls, under a sky glowing with hope, a silent threat crept in, unseen and unfelt, except by one creature whose instincts had been sharpened by gunfire and blood. Guardian, lying faithfully beside Mira's cradle near the stage, suddenly raised his head. His ears perked up, his gentle eyes sharpened into focus. A soft breeze carried a strange scent, one that didn't belong to any resident of the town. It was a mix of stale tobacco, cold metal, and something eerily similar to the sweaty stench of unease. It wasn't popcorn. It wasn't cotton candy. It wasn't the perfume of children. It was dangerous. He leaned forward, sniffing more intently. His gaze swept across the venue, past every tent, every cluster of people, until it locked onto a shadowy figure standing apart near the auction display. A tall, lean man in a long black coat, wearing a low-brimmed cap, was scanning the crowd with darting eyes. He didn't look, or smell, like anyone Guardian knew. And it wasn't just the gaze. It was the swift, deliberate movement of the man's hand slipping into his coat that made Guardian leap up. That motion was far too familiar, straight from a battlefield. He didn't bark. Instead, he growled low, lowered his body, and, like an arrow from a bow, launched through the crowd. Just as the man began to draw a metallic object from his coat, Guardian lunged, knocking over drinks, scattering children's shrieks, then pounced, pinning the stranger down. His powerful jaws locked onto the wrist, clutching what was now visible, a handgun. Ethan Brower, haunted by a dark past and an unquenchable grudge, staggered, howling in pain as Guardian's force slammed him to the ground. The dog refused to let go, his eyes blazing with focus. Guardian clamped down tight until the gun flew from Ethan's hand. Only then did he ease back a little, still growling, muscles tense, ready to strike again if the man even flinched. Only now did the crowd understand what had just happened. Screams echoed. Children were quickly rushed to safety. Police officers, already set up for festival security, sprang into action, guns drawn, tackling Ethan in seconds. Officer Neil Grant, who had once worked Mira's case, recognized him at once. That's Brower. He's the guy from the child abandonment case. He's back. Ethan was handcuffed, his face pushed into the damp grass, his eyes burning with rage. His hateful stare locked onto Guardian, who still stood firmly in front of Mira's cradle. With a snarl, Ethan hissed, "You damn mutt still breathing." Guardian didn't budge. He only growled, a low, steady sound, not like a wild animal, but like a soldier standing guard over the last piece of his soul. Margaret clutched Mira tightly, her voice trembling but strong as she asked, What was he going to do? A young officer lifted the gun. His voice was cold, chilling. If Guardian hadn't caught his scent, we might have lost at least one child today. The festival ended early, but no one ran in panic. Instead, they slowly gathered around Guardian as Dr. Harris patched up a small wound on his leg. No one said a word, but everyone stared, like they were witnessing a miracle. A spirit that never wavered, who didn't need a reason to protect, just a belief. No one gets left behind. The moment Ethan Brower's gun slipped out from under his coat, Guardian, still curled next to Mira's cradle, sensed the change in the air. It wasn't a sound, nor a word, but the clear scent of danger. A survival instinct, sharpened by battle, lit up inside him. Gunpowder, old leather, the sharp electric smell of sweat and adrenaline. The scent of someone about to do harm crashed into his senses like an alarm. Without hesitation, Guardian launched up. His claws scraped the wooden stage as he flew over the decorative fence around the performance area, now a battlefield. His leap was so powerful it froze the crowd. All sound vanished from the festival. No music, no laughter, only a deep, rumbling growl from Guardian's chest. It wasn't a threat. It was the final warning. His front paws slammed into Ethan's shoulder, knocking him off balance. In the same instant, Guardian's steel-strong jaws clamped around Ethan's wrist cracked as the gun emerged. The pressure was crushing. Ethan screamed, the weapon tumbling from his hand and clattering onto the stones with a sharp, deafening crack. Still, Guardian didn't stop. He twisted, pushed forward, his weight slamming Ethan backward onto the grass, right where children had played moments earlier. The whole fight lasted less than 10 seconds, but to the crowd, it felt like slow motion, breathless and heavy. As Ethan reached behind him, possibly for another weapon, 4 undercover officers burst from the crowd like shadows. One tackled him from behind, another pinned his wrists. The metallic clink of handcuffs cut through the chaos. "Don't move! Police! Drop the weapon!" A child shrieked. A young woman collapsed beside her baby stroller. People threw their hands up instinctively, then silence. The danger was over, and once again, the hero was a dog, unarmed, unnamed, but fearless. Ethan was dragged away, head down, face twisted in rage and pain. His eyes flicked toward the stage, where Mira lay safe in Margaret's arms. Guardian had already returned to his post beside the cradle, as if he'd never left. "That dog spotted him before we did," one officer muttered. "We might owe him more than just today." The townspeople gathered around Guardian. No one dared approach, not out of fear, but awe. A quiet respect for the creature who just saved them all, not from instinct, but from love. Love for a child he'd sworn to protect. On stage, the mayor stepped forward, voice shaking as he took the microphone. "I didn't prepare a speech for this, but if any of you ever doubted miracles or thought loyalty was just a word, look here. A dog. Abandoned. A survivor of the worst. Now the one who saved us from the next worst thing. That is Guardian." The applause wasn't for performances or speeches. It was for a silent warrior, a true hero who never asked for glory, only the chance to do what he was born to do. Protect the fragile things. Guardian didn't bark. He didn't move. He just looked up at Mira as she reached a tiny hand from her blanket to touch his ear. His tail gave a soft wag. For a moment, the world was quiet again. Even after the Hearts for Hope festival ended, Evansdale couldn't return to normal. People kept talking about Guardian like he was a legend, a walking miracle. A photo of him mid-leap, tackling an armed man during the celebration, made the front page of the local paper. A hero without armor, but with an unyielding heart. But while the outside world painted the story in golden light, inside the Evansdale Police Department, a darker picture was forming. Inspector Neil Grant, a former soldier turned cop, couldn't shake his unease. Ever since he'd seen Ethan Brower in handcuffs, something gnawed at him. There was something too calm, too knowing in Ethan's eyes, like a man who expected to fail, yet showed up anyway. Because he was only one small piece of a much larger, darker plan. That evening, long after the paperwork was filed, Neil stayed behind in the office. He pulled out the old case file on Mira's discovery. No birth certificate, no fingerprint matches in any database, no missing child reports. The phone box where Guardian had found her, aside from the dog's paw prints, held only one faint footprint in the mud. Military-issued boots, size 11. Ethan's exact size back then. It had been ruled as anonymous abandonment. Now the pieces were forming a far more disturbing picture. Neil ordered a re-examination of Ethan's belongings, a wiped phone, a memory card, and a half-torn leather notebook. With help from the state's digital forensics team, the encrypted data on the memory card was finally unlocked. As the screen lit up with rows of text, the room turned ice cold. Among the files was a spreadsheet of coded entries, dates, symbols, and a chilling column titled Estimated Delivery Time. Each row listed a set of initials, as if each child was nothing more than a shipment in transit. On the fifth line, Neil saw something that hit like a punch to the gut. Number 5C, Mira, female, 3 weeks old, weight 2.9 kilograms, status, discarded due to unmanageable risk. Note, left at forest edge, recovery failed, no rescue personnel arrived in time. Neil's chest tightened. Mira. It didn't take a genius to realize it meant Mira. But what haunted him most was the note. No rescue personnel arrived in time. It meant the child had been meant to disappear, left behind intentionally, her loss written off as an accident. But Ethan had miscalculated. He hadn't counted on one thing, a being that shouldn't have still existed. A dog once named Maverick, now known only as Guardian. Neil couldn't sit still anymore. He ordered the military file on Sergeant Caleb Brower, Ethan's brother. Caleb had once been the lead K-9 handler in an elite unit. He'd vanished during a mission, marked failure were in the Middle East, a mission tied to transporting child relief supplies for the NGO, Sunway, a group later exposed as a front for an international infant trafficking ring. Going over the timeline again, Neil found a shocking connection. Caleb disappeared just after being caught trying to withdraw Maverick's medical records, likely in an attempt to save his dog from being decommissioned after the mission failed. From that moment, Caleb vanished from all records, along with Maverick. Ethan was probably just a courier, Neil muttered, staring at the newly reconstructed trafficking network diagram. Red threads crossed names and acronyms like a spider's web, but Mira wasn't just meant to be discarded. She was a test, to see if anyone would try to intervene. And Guardian? He didn't just intervene. He changed the game. On Neil's desk, a photo from the festival sat beside the map, Mira laughing, reaching out as Guardian licked her tiny hand. One image bathed in light, one chart drowning in shadows, and in between them stood a dog, once erased, once broken. Now, the Seakoken last Guardian, standing between fragile life and the monsters hiding in plain sight. Neil exhaled slowly and turned to Linda Carter, who had just arrived to collect the updated file. "We're not just taking care of a child and a dog," he said quietly. "We're holding the two most important living witnesses to a criminal network, and Mira. She might be the key to a truth they buried long ago." When Neil placed the photo of Guardian and Mira beside the trafficking network map, he knew his heart was leading him right. But instinct wasn't enough. The law demanded proof. Justice needed in names. In an emergency meeting with state tech teams and federal agents, Neil authorized a DNA test for Mira to be matched against the national database of missing children, a final step to uncover her past, not just to answer who she was, but to give her back the one thing every child deserves: an identity. The results arrived 3 days later. 3 agonizing days for Margaret, who kept caring for Mira as if she were her own. Yet a quiet fear gnawed at her, that when the truth came, it might rip the child away forever. But when Neil opened the thin envelope, his face showed no hesitation. He read the report slowly, then lingered over a photo: a young woman with brown hair, hollow eyes, and a crumpled ultrasound image clutched to her chest. The look of a mother who never stopped searching. The DNA was a perfect match. Mira's real name was Olivia May Harper, daughter of Amanda Harper, an elementary school teacher from Missouri. Amanda had reported her newborn missing from the hospital just 9 days after birth. The case had once shaken the town, but went cold when security footage was destroyed and no trace of the baby remained. The only clue? Someone posing as medical staff took the infant for a routine checkup and vanished. All that was left was a shattered mother. When the news reached Amanda, she screamed until her voice gave out. Then she fell silent for hours. Finally, when an Indiana officer called to ask if she'd come to Evansdale to confirm a miracle, all she could whisper was, "I never stopped hoping." For Linda Carter, who'd once labeled Mira's file "abandoned infant, case closed," the truth hit like lightning. Everything changed. Mira hadn't been abandoned, she'd been stolen. And Guardian? He wasn't just a rescuer, he was the one who stopped it. Neil drove to Margaret's home that afternoon, a folded case file in his hand. His steps were heavy, not from duty, but from the weight of what he carried. Not just legal documents, but a truth that might break the heart of a woman who had loved without conditions. He stepped into the warm wooden house. Guardian lay, as always, beside Mira's crib, alert but calm. Margaret sat humming lullabies, rocking the girl gently, as if nothing had changed. Neil paused in the doorway, words stuck in his throat. But Margaret spoke first, her voice soft as she rested a hand over Mira's sleeping head. "I know, Neil. She was never mine, but she's always been Lo's." Neil fell silent. Then he placed the file on the table like an apology to the universe. "Her real name is Olivia, and her mother is on her way." At that, Guardian stirred. He lifted his head, fixing Neil with deep, knowing eyes. No challenge, no resistance. Just one quiet question. Will she be safe? And Neil, with the conviction of a man who had seen too much brokenness, answered without words. He knelt, laid his hand on Guardian's head, and bowed low. The weight of truth. When Neil left the small house on Maple Drive, his heart trembled with something too complex to name. Relief, yes, the truth was finally free. But mostly dread. Because truth, even in justice's name, could tear apart sacred things if not handled with care. A mother's return. 3 days later, Amanda Harper arrived in Evansdale, quietly, without cameras or fanfare. Just a small suitcase and a bouquet of one white gerbera daisies, the flower of enduring faith. She stood on Margaret's porch for a long time, staring through the window. Inside, she saw Olivia, not Mira, playing with a small ball. Beside her, as always, laid on Guardian, his watchful eyes tracking the child's every move. It was Margaret who opened the door, a silver-haired woman who had lived most of her life without husband or children, yet loved this little girl with the fierce devotion of a mother. For a heartbeat, the two women stood face to face, one bound by blood, the other by heart. Neither needed an introduction, they simply knew. And in that modest kitchen, over cups of steaming tea at a worn wooden table, Amanda's hands trembled around her teacup as she spoke of those first empty days. The hospital corridors searched in vain, the DNA samples sent to every state database, the night spent tracing the fading ink of that last sonogram with shaking fingers. Her voice carried no accusation, only the faintest waver at the edges. I used to think, if I ever held her again, I'd never unclench my hands. But seeing how she fits against your shoulder, a tear fell into her tea. Some arms were meant to catch her first. Margaret didn't answer immediately. The steam from their cups curled between them as she watched Guardian's ribs rise and fall in the next room, his body a living barricade between Mira's crib and the door. "These hands never cradled a newborn of my own," she said at last, turning her work-worn palms upward. "But when they put that ice-cold bundle in my arms, this tiny thing turning blue at the edges, I thought, no, this one gets to stay warm." The afternoon sun stretched their shadows long across the hardwood as three hearts rearranged themselves around a single truth. Not a battle for possession, but the quiet mathematics of how much love a child could hold from different coordinates. When Amanda pushed the signed guardianship papers across the kitchen table, her fingernails left crescent moons in the margins. The note beneath read in careful script, "To love her is to leave her where she blooms." The amended birth certificate would read Mira Olivia Lewis by week's end, with Margaret's name in bold black ink and Amanda's as a footnote in parentheses, the way spring remembers the shape of last winter's frost. At the courthouse, the clerk stamped Guardian's new credentials with unnecessary force, as if the sound might make it more real. The embossed seal on his therapy certification still smelled faintly of alcohol when they pressed it to his collar. No one mentioned how his military discharge papers had once used the same font to declare him surplus equipment. The town hall smelled of lemon polish and the mayor's aftershave when he knelt to fasten the embroidered band around Guardian's wrist. "For the dog who redefined home," he announced to scattered applause, though his fingers lingered on the stitches. "You were never lost. You were always on your way home." That night, Margaret hung Guardian's framed certificate slightly crooked above the crib. Through the nursery monitor, she could hear the synchronized rhythm of their breathing. The girl who'd been lost, the dog who'd been thrown away, now keeping time together. The paperwork on her kitchen table called this a closed case, but the foundation paperwork waiting to be filed would read in bold letters, "The Mira and Guardian Initiative," because some stories don't end at the happy ending. They branch where the light runs out. The foundation would have two beating hearts, protecting abandoned children and rescuing broken animals, especially dogs discarded by the military or service programs. This wasn't some boardroom initiative, but something born from countless nights Margaret spent by Mira's crib, Guardian warming her feet, tea cooling untouched in her hands as one question haunted the steam. If their paths hadn't crossed in that exact way, under that exact moon, would either have survived to see the dawn? Their first office was just their repurposed living room, filing cabinets nudging against toy chests, the hallway lined not with donor plaques but with snapshots frozen in time. Mira's first bath where Guardian licked soap bubbles off her toes, the day she took her steps using his fur as leverage. Not decor. Evidence. Proof that this wasn't charity work. It was sanctuary for souls the world had tried to erase. Margaret became the heart of it all, while Linda handled the legal spine. Neil, freshly retired from the force, built the operational skeleton, his contacts turning federal red tape into backroads for rescue missions. Early cases were small: a baby left in a truck stop bathroom, 3 beagles crammed in a roadside cage. But within weeks, over 100 pleas arrived, not just from across Indiana, but from voices who'd followed Mira and Guardian's story in the dark corners of their own lives. They came bearing wounds, yes, but also carrying the first fragile seeds of hope. When the press returned, it wasn't for the sensational hero story anymore. That same reporter who'd broken the original piece came back with a different lens, capturing how one act of courage had fractalized into an entire ecosystem of salvation. Her headline said it plain: "From discarded dog to beacon for the broken." The subhead hummed with quiet power: "The Mira and Guardian Foundation, where every life gets its second chapter." At their first fundraiser, held in that same park where everything had changed, Mira, now a sunbeam of a 3-year-old, wove between donation booths, her laughter stitching the afternoon together. Guardian moved slower these days, but his eyes never left her, the scarf around his neck declaring, "Still here, still watching," in child-stitched letters. Margaret kept her speech shorter than anyone expected. Just a hand on Mira's shoulder, a nod toward Guardian drowsing under the oak tree where he'd once intercepted death. Her voice carried clear across the crowd. I didn't build this because I'm brave. I built it because I was terrified, until I saw a creature with every reason to hate the world choose to love it anyway. Her fingers brushed the scar on her wrist, the one from Mira's ice-cold first grip. That's when I learned love isn't just shelter. It's an arrow, and it always finds its way back to where the story started. And so Evansdale Central Park, where Guardian had once leapt into chaos, where the Hearts for Hope Festival's joy had almost turned to tragedy, became the stage for one last celebration, not of endings, but of how far a single act of courage can ripple when met with open hands. But because they were witnessing its living epilogue, the autumn leaves swirled around them like nature's own applause as Guardian, ever patient, ever steady, lowered his head to nuzzle against Mira's cheek, his tail sweeping the stage in one slow, contented arc. The mayor's hand shook as he fastened the medal's clasp, not gold nor silver, but hammered bronze in the shape of an oak leaf, chosen because roots hold fast even when storms come. When he straightened, the entire park fell silent except for three sounds: the rustle of the great oak above them, Mira's giggles as Guardian's whiskers tickled her nose, and the soft, rhythmic thump of a dog's tail keeping time with a town's heartbeat. Then something remarkable happened. Without prompting, every child in the front rows, some holding stuffed Guardian lookalikes, others clutching well-worn copies of the picture book about his heroism, stood and placed their right hands over their hearts in unison. Not because they'd been told to, but because their parents had all done the same. The gesture spread row by row until hundreds of hands rested where gratitude lived, their palms warming the space above their ribs as if trying to physically contain what they felt. Margaret, watching from the side with tears cutting silent paths through her smile, realized this wasn't just an award ceremony anymore. It had become something far more profound, a communal vow. These people weren't just honoring a dog. They were promising to carry forward the lesson he'd etched into their town's bones: that love shown without expectation can rewrite destinies. As the applause finally faded and folks began gathering their picnic blankets, no one rushed to leave. Strangers shared thermoses of cider. Children played tag around the oak's massive trunk. An old man in a veteran's cap knelt slowly beside Guardian, not to pet him, but to press his forehead briefly against the dog's in what looked like sacred acknowledgement. And through it all, Mira remained curled against Guardian's side, one small hand forever tangled in the fur above his medal, as if she'd found her North Star and saw no reason to ever let go. The newspaper headline the next morning would read, "Not just a good dog, the best of us." But the truest epitaph was already being written in the way Evansdale's residents paused that afternoon. How they looked at their own pets with new tenderness, how they held their children's hands a little tighter at crosswalks, how the cashier at the grocery store slipped an extra muffin into the single mother's bag without comment. Small, quiet things. The kind of things that don't make headlines, but do make communities whole. Because that's what Guardian's legacy had truly become. Not grand gestures, but the courage to care fiercely in a world that often rewards hardness. And as the last of the autumn light gilded the medal now hanging above Mira's bed that night, casting star-shaped reflections across her sleeping face, Guardian lay watching them dance on the walls. This old soldier turned guardian angel, his breathing slow and even, his work complete, his heart full. But because the moment made them believe that goodness was real, that sometimes it comes from a being without words, who walks through darkness only to preserve the light. As the last rays of the day lit up the medal on Guardian's chest, the town stood not to bid farewell to a legend, but to welcome a living piece of history into their hearts. Not as a dog, but as a silent hero who never stopped believing in what was right. After the thunderous applause at the medal ceremony, where the entire town of Evansdale stood as one to call out, "My puppy hero," the spotlight eventually dimmed. But what remained wasn't fame. It was something quieter, more enduring. A warmth, like the steady flame of a fireplace on a winter night, kept alive not by stage lights, but by the heart. Time passed. Mira, now 5 years old, was no longer the frail little girl once curled up in a crib beside the hearth. She had grown into a bright, lively child with soft brown curls and a fondness for carrying picture books wherever she went. And each afternoon, she read them aloud, page by page, to a very special listener, Guardian. The old dog's coat had turned silver, and his eyes no longer sparkled the way they once did, but they still shone with the same softness, the same kindness that once lit the way for a forgotten child in a frozen forest. Each evening, as sunlight slanted through the window, Mira would lay out a wool blanket by the door, help Guardian settle down beside her, wrap her little arms around one of his ears, and begin reading in a clear, gentle voice. Once upon a time, there was a brave dog named Guardian, and even though he no longer had the strength to wag his tail much, Guardian would lower his head into her lap, slowly close his eyes, and listen, as if reliving each page of the story written from his own life. Between them, there were no longer boundaries between human and animal, no border between past and present, just one quiet, unbreakable thread: unconditional love. Around them, a pack of young German shepherds, rescued from the animal shelter, raced across the lawn, barking in bursts like the cheerful symphony of a generation beginning its journey. One of them, a timid pup named Ash, would often tiptoe over to Guardian and press his nose to the elder's front leg, like a child learning to listen from their very first teacher. Guardian never barked, never interrupted the play. He simply lay there, calm as an old tree in the yard, letting the young ones grow beneath his shadow, fall freely, and learn to rise again, just as he once had in the cold wind and mud of a long-ago storm. Inside the house, Margaret, now with snow-white hair, sat quietly by the window, sewing red bandanas for the pups. Each one was hand-stitched with the same 3 words: loved, trusted, needed. She said every soul deserved that, regardless of where they came from or what species they were. The house on Maple Drive was no longer just a shelter. It had truly become a home for those once left behind, but who had now found each other and begun again. And if anyone ever asked Margaret what made her believe in miracles, she wouldn't speak of medals. She wouldn't mention the hundreds of articles ever written about them. Instead, she would quietly open the back door and point toward the most peaceful scene her life had ever known. A tired old dog resting in the sun, a little girl, once rescued, now reading aloud beside him, the soft pitter-patter of young paws across the grass, the gentle rustle of pages turning, and the steady, quiet rhythm of a heart that was still protecting it all, not with strength, but with a love that had never grown tired. As twilight draped the backyard in golden hues and the last maple leaves swirled in the breeze like letters sent from autumn itself, Mira, now taller, her hair longer, her once baby voice able to hum melodies, still kept her cherished ritual. Each evening, she walked out to the old oak tree where Guardian used to lie. Under the soft light, his back rested against the roots, his gaze quietly watching her every move, like a silent gatekeeper to her little world. He was no longer strong, his legs were weak, his breathing at times was heavy in the warm air, but his eyes still held the same gentleness, the same eyes that once lit the way for a tiny girl lost in the rain-soaked woods. Miera stepped softly, holding a comic book she had started drawing herself. On the cover was a large dog sheltering a child in a foam box with an umbrella. She didn't speak at first. She just sat beside Guardian, pressed her cheek to his shoulder and listened, to each slow breath, to each tiny shift in a body that had weathered so many storms but never wavered. The breeze rustled gently through the trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches, dotting Guardian's silvering fur. Mira placed her small hand on his back and, in a whisper, not to the sky, but to the memory that had once saved her life, she said, "Thank you for not leaving me that rainy night." Guardian stirred slightly. His ears twitched. Then he inhaled deeply, as if to draw in the last scent of the day. The smell of her hair, the sound of her voice, and the warmth of her hand, keeping them all tucked into his heart like a final lullaby before sleep. There was no bark, no answer needed. But Mira understood, because the peace in Guardian's closed eyes wasn't of someone who had finished a task, but of a soul who had loved completely and been loved in return. Around them, the younger dogs, now bigger, stronger, played in the fading light, but none crossed the invisible boundary around the oak tree. They too seemed to know something sacred was happening beneath those branches, a quiet goodbye between two souls who had found each other at the end of the world. Inside the wooden house, Margaret stood by the window, watching the silhouette of Mira and Guardian, surrounded by amber light. And she knew this friendship wasn't ending. It was only transforming into something that didn't need a body to exist, into a loyalty that would continue to follow a little girl wherever she grew. As one last breeze swept through the yard, an oak leaf floated down onto Guardian's silvered coat. Someone, perhaps Mira herself, whispered, not aloud, but deep within, "You didn't save me once. You saved me forever." When the final oak leaves of autumn gently settled over the still frame resting by the old tree, Guardian, the once abandoned German shepherd, the storm-tossed wanderer with no name and no home, chose his moment of departure in the quietest way. Beside the girl he had rescued, protected, grown with, and loved with every breath of his life, there was no howl, no warning. But every heart that had ever known Guardian felt a hush open wide, a silent absence, not from a life ending, but from a symbol rising into eternity. Margaret held Mira in trembling arms beneath the oak at dusk. They didn't cry out, they didn't wail. They just clung to each other, trying to hold on to the last warmth Guardian had left behind. The younger dogs, heirs to that same fierce loyalty, sat quietly around the fresh patch of earth, now softened with grass. They didn't bark. They simply nestled close, sensing that the great tree had fallen, but its shade would remain forever. 3 days later, all of Evansdale paused. Shops closed. Schools went quiet. The town gathered for a memorial called the Gatekeeper's Journey, held at the same park where Guardian had once received his Medal of Bravery. No long speeches, no elaborate displays, just real stories, real photos, real tears and laughter that quivered through memories once thought too small to matter. Like the time Guardian nudged the first ball into Mira's crib, or lay frozen through a thunderstorm beside a foam box no one else saw. A short film played on the big screen. It opened in grainy black and white, a soaked dog trudging through mud. No narration, just footsteps. Then came fragments. Guardian watching Mira sleep, blocking strangers with his body, barking just in time when Mira stopped breathing one night. These weren't dramatizations. They were real moments, woven together like a lullaby, carrying the room from awe to stillness, from reverence to tears. And finally, As the light on the screen dimmed, one last image appeared. Guardian lying peacefully beneath the oak tree, sunlight scattered through leaves above him, and Mira's tiny hand resting on his back. A simple image, but one that said it all. Beneath it, two words. Welcome home. Words slowly appeared from the shadows. From a storm rose a soul who chose to stay. Then, on a blank white screen, the final line echoed in silence. Sometimes, the ones the world casts aside are the very ones who save it. The entire hall stood. No one told them to. There were no fireworks, just wave after wave of gentle, unwavering applause for a soul that once went unnoticed, yet lived like a lantern through the long night. For a dog who didn't just save a child, but taught a town to love again. Who reminded the world that loyalty doesn't come from where we're born, but where we choose to stand when it matters most. A small bronze statue was placed beneath the oak tree, not tall, not grand, just Guardian lying with his head lifted, eyes forward, waiting, as if Mira might come running with a book. On the base, only one line was etched. He didn't speak, but he said everything. Mira, now 6 years old, placed a sunflower at the statue's feet, then turned toward the children at the foundation's center, cradling a rescued pup from the week before. Her eyes sparkled like spring sun. She had begun telling the story now, not as a survivor, but as a keeper of the flame. Once upon a time, there was a dog. His name was Guardian. He never gave up, and because of him, I lived. Now I'm going to do that for someone else. And just like that, Guardian's legacy wasn't kept behind glass in a museum. It lived in every heart held close at the Mira and Guardian Foundation. It breathed in every arm that reached to save a shivering stray. It moved in every glance of trust rebuilt after being broken. Guardian left as a dog, but returned as a symbol. No last name, no vow, only a quiet, magnificent choice to stay. The story of Guardian, a nameless dog who quietly saved a child and warmed an entire town, is more than a tale of storms survived. It's proof that kindness, loyalty, and love can rewrite destiny, even when they come from souls the world tried to forget. From a foam box in the rain, from a weak cry in the woods, to a living monument in the hearts of thousands. Guardian didn't just leave paw prints. He left a legacy no one can erase. Have you ever witnessed a moment when an animal saved a human? Share your story in the comments, because your words might be the light someone out there is waiting for. And if Guardian's journey moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help us spread stories of goodness and love without borders. Because sometimes it's the forgotten souls who end up saving the world.